I was drinking my morning coffee on the wraparound porch of my grandfather's old log cabin when a silver Mercedes pulled into my gravel driveway, kicking up dust that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. A woman in her mid-50s stepped out, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that looked completely out of place against the backdrop of my rustic Montana property. She clutched a leather portfolio against her chest like a shield and marched toward me with the kind of determination that made my stomach sink. "Good morning," I called out, setting my mug on the wooden railing. "Can I help you? Are you Jacob Winters?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "That's me. I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Clearwater Pines Homeowners Association." She said it like she expected me to stand at attention. "We need to discuss your property." I leaned back in my grandfather's old rocking chair, the wood creaking beneath my weight. I wasn't aware I was part of any homeowners association. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Every property within the Clearwater Pines development is subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Your property is in violation of multiple standards, Mr. Winters. Most notably, your wooden house does not meet our architectural guidelines. All structures must be built with approved materials, and log cabins are expressly prohibited under Section 4.2 of our bylaws." I couldn't help but laugh. "Ma'am, this house was built in 1947 by my grandfather. He cleared this land himself, cut every log, and raised this cabin with his own 2 hands." "That may be," Patricia said, flipping open her portfolio, "but our HOA was established in 1998, and all properties within our boundaries must comply with current standards. You have 30 days to either bring your property into compliance or face daily fines of $500. You want me to tear down my grandfather's house, or reside it with approved materials? We have a list of contractors who can install vinyl siding or stucco over the existing structure." She pulled out a sheet of paper and tried to hand it to me. I didn't take it. "This property has been in my family for almost 80 years. How exactly does your HOA, which has existed for less than 30, have any authority over it?" Patricia's expression shifted from officious to annoyed. "Mr. Winters, when the previous owner sold this land, they agreed to the HOA terms. Those terms transfer with the deed. My grandfather never sold anything. He died 3 years ago and left this property to my father, who passed it to me last year. No sale, no transfer outside the family. Then your grandfather must have signed the HOA agreement when it was formed. My grandfather had dementia by 1998. He was in a care facility in Billings. He wasn't signing anything." For the first time, Patricia looked uncertain, but she recovered quickly, straightening her shoulders. "Regardless of the circumstances, your property is within HOA boundaries. You'll be receiving official notice by certified mail. Good day, Mr. Winters." She turned on her heel and walked back to her Mercedes, leaving me standing on the porch with cold coffee and a growing sense of dread. I'd moved to Montana 6 months ago, taking remote work as a software developer to escape the chaos of Seattle. The cabin was supposed to be my fresh start, a connection to family history and simpler times. Now some HOA president was threatening to fine me into bankruptcy over a house that had stood here decades before her precious association even existed. I went inside and dug through the filing cabinet where I'd stored all the property documents after my father's funeral. The deed was there, yellowed with age, dated August 15, 1947. My grandfather's signature was still legible in faded blue ink. I found the will, the transfer documents, and every piece of paper related to the property. Nowhere was there any mention of a homeowners association. 3 days later, the certified letter arrived, exactly as Patricia had promised. It was even more aggressive than our conversation, listing violations that included the log construction, the unapproved green metal roof, the gravel driveway instead of paved asphalt, and the excessive garden area where I'd planted vegetables in what they claimed should be maintained lawn space. The fines would start accumulating on April 15th if I didn't present a compliance plan. I called a real estate attorney in Missoula named Robert Chen. His secretary scheduled me for the following Monday. Over the weekend, I did some research. Clearwater Pines was a development that had sprung up in the late 1990s when a company called Mountain Vista Homes bought a large tract of land adjacent to Flathead Lake. They'd built about 200 homes, all cookie-cutter McMansions with strict architectural guidelines. Somehow, my grandfather's 40-acre parcel had ended up inside their platted boundaries, at least according to the map on the HOA website. Robert Chen's office was in a renovated Victorian house downtown. He was younger than I expected, probably in his late 30s, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. "Tell me everything," he said, pulling out a legal pad. I explained the situation, showing him the deed, the HOA letter, and the property survey I'd found in my grandfather's papers. Robert studied each document carefully, occasionally making notes. "This is interesting," he said finally. "Your deed predates the HOA by 51 years. That's significant. So they can't force me to comply. It's not that simple." Sometimes older properties get grandfathered into new developments, especially if there were errors in the original platting or if property lines weren't clearly established. But your deed should protect you. The question is whether your grandfather ever signed anything that would have subjected the property to HOA rules. He couldn't have. He had dementia by the time the HOA formed. Robert nodded slowly. "We'll need to request all documentation from the HOA showing how your property became part of their association. They have to provide proof that the property was legally included. If they can't, you're not bound by their rules." "How long will this take?" "Could be a few weeks, could be months." "Depends on how cooperative they are." He leaned back in his chair. "In the meantime, don't pay any fines, don't sign anything, don't agree to any modifications. Just sit tight and let me handle the communication." I left his office feeling slightly better but still uneasy. That uneasiness proved justified when I got home and found a bright orange notice stapled to my front door. "Violation of HOA standards, immediate attention required." Below that was a list of the same complaints, but with an added note that I was forbidden from making any further modifications to the property until my compliance plan was approved. I called Robert immediately. "They put a notice on my door. Can they do that?" "They can put up whatever notices they want, but that doesn't make them enforceable. Ignore it. I'll send them a letter tomorrow informing them that you're represented by counsel and all future communication should go through me." "Will that stop them?" There was a pause. "It should. But in my experience, aggressive HOAs don't back down easily. Be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." He was right. 2 weeks later, I was working in my home office when I heard a truck rumbling up the driveway. I looked out to see a tow truck backing up to my 1972 Ford pickup, the restoration project I'd inherited along with the house. I ran outside. "Hey, what are you doing?" The driver, a heavy-set man in a greasy t-shirt, held up a work order. "Got a call to remove an abandoned vehicle." "That's not abandoned. That's my truck. Says here it's been sitting in the same spot for over 30 days, no license plates, looks inoperable. HOA says it's got to go. The HOA doesn't have authority to tow my vehicle from my own property." The driver shrugged. "I just do what I'm told, buddy. Take it up with them." I pulled out my phone and called Robert while positioning myself between the tow truck and my grandfather's Ford. "Robert, they're trying to tow my truck right now. Don't let them take it. That's theft. Tell the driver if he removes that vehicle, you'll file a police report." I relayed the message. The driver looked annoyed but unhooked his chains. "Fine, but the HOA's gonna call again." After he left, I checked the truck more carefully. Someone had put a bright yellow sticker on the windshield. "Abandoned vehicle removal scheduled." The sticker wasn't there the day before. Robert filed an emergency motion the next morning, requesting a temporary restraining order against the HOA to prevent them from taking any action against my property or possessions while the legal questions were resolved. The hearing was set for May 3rd. In the meantime, Patricia wasn't done. She started showing up at my property unannounced, always with a different complaint. The wood pile beside my house was unsightly. The chicken coop I'd built for 6 laying hens was agricultural use prohibited in residential zones. The solar panels I'd installed on the roof weren't the right color. Each visit ended with her promising more fines, more consequences. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Winters," she said during her 4th visit. "If you'd just work with us, we could find a solution." "My solution is for you to leave me alone. This property isn't part of your HOA. You can keep saying that, but you're wrong. And the longer you delay compliance, the more expensive this becomes for you." After she left, I walked the property line, following the survey markers my grandfather had placed decades ago. The nearest Clearwater Pines house was almost half a mile away, separated from my land by a thick stand of ponderosa pines and a seasonal creek. How had they convinced themselves that my property was part of their development? The answer came when Robert called me on April 28th. "I got the documentation from the HOA's attorney. Jacob, you need to see this." I drove to Missoula that afternoon. Robert had the papers spread across his conference table. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a plat map dated 1996. "This is the original survey for the Clearwater Pines development. See those boundaries?" I studied the map. My grandfather's property was clearly marked with a notation, Parcel 23A Winters not included in development. "So they knew," I said. "Wait, it gets better." Robert pulled out another map, this one dated 2003. "This is an amended plat filed 5 years after the development was completed. Look at the boundaries now." The lines had been redrawn. My grandfather's property was now inside the HOA boundaries with no notation excluding it. "How is that legal?" "It's not," Robert said. "You can't amend a plat to include property you don't own without the owner's consent." But here's where it gets interesting. Look at the signature line for property owner approval. There was a signature, Harold Winters, my grandfather. "That's not his signature," I said immediately. "I've seen my grandfather's handwriting on dozens of documents. This isn't even close." Robert nodded grimly. "I thought it looked suspicious. We're going to need a handwriting expert to confirm it, but I think someone forged your grandfather's signature to make it look like he approved including his property in the HOA. Who would do that? That's the question." The amended plat was filed by Mountain Vista Homes, the original developer. The company went bankrupt in 2008, but I'm tracking down the principals. If we can prove forgery, this whole thing falls apart. And Patricia Hendricks, she became HOA president in 2018, well after this happened. She probably has no idea the property was fraudulently included, but that doesn't excuse her behavior. The restraining order hearing on May 3rd was held in the Flathead County Courthouse. Patricia showed up with the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man named Gregory Walsh, who wore a suit that probably cost more than my truck. Robert presented our evidence: the original deed, the 2 plat maps, and a preliminary opinion from a handwriting expert stating that the signature on the 2003 amendment was inconsistent with known samples of my grandfather's writing. Judge Margaret Sorensen listened carefully, asking pointed questions. When Robert finished, she turned to Walsh. "Counselor, do you have any documentation showing that Harold Winters consented to including his property in the HOA?" Walsh shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, the amended plat clearly shows his signature." "An apparently forged signature," the judge said. "Do you have anything else?" "The property is within the development boundaries. It's been treated as part of the HOA for over 20 years. Treating it as part of the HOA doesn't make it so, especially if the original inclusion was fraudulent." Judge Sorensen made a note. "I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA is prohibited from taking any action against Mr. Winters or his property, including assessing fines, until this matter is fully resolved. We'll schedule a full hearing for August." Patricia looked stunned. Walsh tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. "My order stands. Mr. Winters, you're free to use your property as you see fit. This hearing is adjourned. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as we left the courtroom, but Robert cautioned me on the way out. This is just round one. They're not going to give up easily, especially if there's fraudulent documentation involved. They might try to claim they relied on those documents in good faith. What happens if we prove the signature was forged? Then we potentially have criminal fraud charges against whoever filed that amended plat, and your property is definitively not part of the HOA. Over the next several weeks, I tried to return to normal life. I worked on my coding projects, tended my garden, and even got the old Ford running with help from a mechanic in town. But Patricia wasn't done making my life difficult. She couldn't take direct action against my property anymore, but she found other ways to harass me. She filed a complaint with the county zoning board, claiming my chicken coop violated agricultural zoning laws. That got dismissed when I showed that keeping a small number of chickens was explicitly permitted on residential properties. She called the health department, claiming my well water was contaminating neighboring properties. An inspector came out, tested the water, and found nothing wrong. Then she tried a different approach. In mid-June, I got a call from my internet service provider saying they needed to cancel my service because there was an issue with the utility easement on my property. When I pressed for details, they admitted the HOA had claimed the easement was private and I wasn't authorized to use it. Robert sent another strongly worded letter, and the internet service was restored. But it was clear Patricia was going to use every possible avenue to make my life miserable. What I didn't understand was why. The HOA had hundreds of other properties to manage. Why fixate on mine? The answer came in July when Robert called with news. I found something. Remember how I was tracking down the principals from Mountain Vista Homes? Yeah. One of them was a man named Charles Hendricks. He was the chief financial officer. It took me a second. Hendricks, like Patricia, her ex-husband. They divorced in 2010, 2 years after the company went bankrupt. But here's the interesting part. Charles was the one who signed the amended plat in 2003. He's the one who would have had the motive and opportunity to forge your grandfather's signature. Why would he want my grandfather's property in the HOA? I did some more digging. In 2003, Mountain Vista Homes was struggling financially. They'd promised investors a certain number of units in the development. By including your grandfather's 40 acres, they inflated their numbers, made it look like the development was bigger and more valuable than it actually was. So this was fraud from the beginning. Looks like it. And Patricia might not have known, but now she's doubling down because admitting the error would expose her ex-husband's crimes and potentially open the HOA to liability. What do? We're going to bring criminal charges. I've already contacted the county prosecutor's office. They're interested. The full hearing in August turned into something much bigger. The county prosecutor, a stern woman named Linda Martinez, filed fraud charges against Charles Hendricks, who was now living in Arizona. He was extradited back to Montana in September to face trial. Patricia, meanwhile, was called to testify about what she knew and when she knew it. I attended the preliminary hearing in October. Charles Hendricks looked like he'd aged a decade since his company went bankrupt. He sat next to his attorney, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The prosecutor presented evidence showing that he'd systematically inflated the size of the Clearwater Pines development by including properties that were never actually part of it, including mine. He'd forged multiple signatures, not just my grandfather's. Your Honor, Linda Martinez said, Mr. Hendricks engaged in a pattern of fraud that deceived investors, homebuyers, and county officials. His actions have caused ongoing harm to property owners like Mr. Winters, who have been subjected to invalid HOA rules and harassment based on fraudulent documentation. Charles's attorney tried to argue that too much time had passed, that the statute of limitations had expired. But the prosecutor pointed out that the fraud was ongoing as the HOA continued to rely on the false documents to assert authority over properties. Judge Sorensen, The same judge who'd granted my restraining order wasn't sympathetic. "Mr. Hendricks, you'll stand trial on multiple counts of fraud and forgery. Bail is set at $50,000. Patricia was in the courtroom that day. When I saw her afterward in the hallway, she looked deflated. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I swear I didn't know what Charles did." "But you kept pushing even after you found out my deed predated the HOA. I thought there had to be an explanation. I thought maybe your grandfather had agreed verbally, or there was some document we hadn't found." She shook her head. "I built my whole identity around that HOA. Being president meant something. It meant I was important, that I mattered. I couldn't admit it was all built on a lie. You made my life hell for months. I know, and I'm sorry." She looked at me, and for the first time I saw something other than officious arrogance. "For what it's worth, I've resigned as HOA president, and I've recommended that the board formally exclude your property from the association. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Thank you." Charles Hendricks's trial took place in December. I testified about my grandfather, about the property history, and about the harassment I'd endured. The handwriting expert testified that the signature on the amended plat was definitively not my grandfather's. Other property owners who'd been fraudulently included came forward with their own stories. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Charles was found guilty on 7 counts of fraud and 4 counts of forgery. At sentencing in January, Judge Sorensen gave him 5 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay restitution to all affected property owners. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, "you treated people's homes and property rights as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. You forged signatures, filed false documents, and caused years of ongoing harm to innocent people. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes." After the sentencing, Robert and I filed a civil suit against the HOA for the harassment I'd endured even after they should have known my property wasn't legitimately part of the association. That case settled in March for $75,000. The HOA also agreed to formally amend their boundaries to exclude my property and publicly acknowledge that it had never been legally part of the association. Patricia ended up cooperating fully with investigators, providing documents and testimony about the HOA's actions. She wasn't charged with any crimes, but she'd lost her position, her reputation in the community, and apparently her sense of purpose. I heard through Robert that she'd moved away from Clearwater Pines, unable to face the neighbors she'd once ruled over. By April, exactly 1 year after Patricia first showed up at my door, everything was finally resolved. I had clear title to my property, no HOA breathing down my neck, and enough settlement money to finish restoring my grandfather's truck and make some improvements to the cabin. I was sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, when my neighbor from down the road stopped by. Tom was an old-timer who'd lived in the area long before Clearwater Pines existed. We'd become friends over the past year. "Heard you won your case," he said, accepting the beer I offered him. "Finally, it's over. Your grandpa would be proud. Harold was stubborn as hell, never would have let those HOA types push him around. I wish I'd known him better. He was already pretty far gone by the time I was old enough to remember. He was a good man. Built this place with his bare hands after he came back from the war. This land meant everything to him." Tom took a sip of his beer. "You keeping it?" "Yeah, I can't imagine being anywhere else now." "Good, that's how it should be." We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the evening sounds of Montana wilderness. The chickens were settling in their coop. The solar panels on the roof had stored enough energy for the night. The garden was ready for spring planting. My grandfather's cabin stood solid and strong, just as it had for almost 80 years. The whole ordeal had taught me something important. Property rights matter. History matters. And some things, like a log cabin built by a veteran's hands in 1947, are worth fighting for, no matter how many HOA presidents try to tear them down. Robert called the next morning with final news. The county has launched a full audit of the Clearwater Pines development. They found 3 other properties that were fraudulently included like yours. All of them are being removed from the HOA boundaries. How did this go unnoticed for so long? Incompetence, mostly. The county recorder's office didn't catch the discrepancies between the original and amended plats. The HOA just assumed the paperwork was in order, and Charles Hendricks was counting on nobody checking too carefully. What happens to the HOA now? They'll survive, but they're facing lawsuits from the other affected property owners, and their credibility is shot. A lot of people are questioning whether they should even exist. Robert paused. You know, this case is getting attention from other property rights advocates. There's a lawyer in Bozeman who wants to write about it for a legal journal. Is that okay? Up to you. But it might help other people in similar situations. I thought about it. Yeah, if it helps someone else stand up to an overreaching HOA, go for it. Over the following weeks, the story did spread. I got calls from reporters, from other homeowners facing HOA disputes, even from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to include my case in a project about property rights. I declined most of the attention, but I did agree to speak at a county commission meeting about HOA oversight. My grandfather bought this land in 1947 with money he saved from his military service, I told the commissioners. He built his home here. He raised his family here. He never agreed to be part of any homeowners association, and he never would have. But someone forged his signature, included his property in an HOA without his consent, and for years that fraud went unchallenged. I'm lucky I had the resources to fight back. A lot of people don't. We need better oversight of HOAs and better protection for property owners. The Commission voted unanimously to create new requirements for HOA formation and boundary changes, including mandatory notification of all affected property owners and regular audits of HOA records. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. By summer, life had returned to a peaceful routine. I'd made friends in the area, people who appreciated the old Montana values of independence and self-reliance. I finished restoring the Ford and took it to a classic car show in Kalispell, where it won 3rd place in its category. The chickens were producing more eggs than I could eat, so I started trading them with neighbors for fresh vegetables and homemade bread. One afternoon in July, almost exactly a year and a half after this whole mess started, I was replacing some boards on the porch when a car pulled up. My first instinct was tension, but then I saw it was just a young couple, probably in their late 20s. They got out hesitantly. "Can I help you?" I called down. "We're sorry to bother you," the woman said. "We're looking at a house down the road in Clearwater Pines." The real estate agent told us about what happened with your property and the HOA. We just wanted to hear your side of the story before we decide whether to buy there. I invited them up to the porch and told them everything. About Patricia's first visit, about the forged signature, about the harassment and the legal battle. They listened carefully, asking good questions. "So would you recommend avoiding HOAs altogether?" the husband asked. "Not necessarily. Some people like having rules and standards for their neighborhood. But you need to do your due diligence. Read every word of the covenants, understand what you're agreeing to, meet the board members, look at their track record, and if anything seems fishy, walk away." The couple thanked me and left. I hoped they'd make the right decision for themselves. The Clearwater Pines HOA had cleaned up its act considerably since Patricia's departure. The new president was a retired accountant who ran things by the book and didn't have an inflated sense of authority. But the development still had strict rules, and that wasn't for everyone. As for me, I was exactly where I wanted to be. The log cabin stood proud and unmodified, its green metal roof gleaming in the afternoon sun. My grandfather's truck was parked beside it, fully restored and running perfectly. The chickens clucked contentedly in their coop. The solar panels hummed quietly, storing energy for the evening. I thought about my grandfather sometimes, about how he'd built this place with such care and determination. He'd survived a war, carved out a life in the Montana wilderness, and created something lasting. When dementia stole his memories and eventually his life, he'd probably never imagined that decades later, someone would try to take what he'd built. But he also probably would have been satisfied knowing that his grandson had fought to protect it. The property had been worth the fight, not just because of its monetary value but because of what it represented: independence, self-reliance, family history. The right to live on your own land the way you choose, without some board of self-appointed authorities telling you what color your roof should be or whether your house is made of approved materials. In September, I got one final piece of closure. Robert called to tell me that the Montana Bar Association had recognized our case in their property rights newsletter. "You're officially a legal precedent now," he said with a laugh. "Future lawyers will cite Winters v. Clearwater Pines HOA when they argue against fraudulent HOA inclusions." Is that good? It's very good. It means other people won't have to go through what you did. Courts will be more skeptical of HOA claims, especially when properties predate the association by decades. I'm glad something good came out of all this. You did more than protect your own property, Jacob. You exposed a system that was failing a lot of people. After we hung up, I walked the property line again, something I'd started doing regularly. 40 acres of Montana forest and meadow with the Flathead Lake visible in the distance. This land had been my grandfather's dream, then my father's inheritance, and now my responsibility. I'd protected it from an overreaching HOA, but more than that, I'd learned what it really meant. It meant waking up to birdsong instead of traffic. It meant growing my own food and raising chickens and fixing things with my own hands. It meant being part of a community of people who valued independence and mutual respect over conformity and rules. It meant honoring the past while building a future. The wooden house that Patricia Hendricks had called a violation of standards was in fact a monument to everything that mattered. Every log my grandfather had cut and placed, every nail he'd driven, every board that had weathered decades of Montana winters. This house had standards all right, just not the kind that could be written into HOA bylaws. As fall approached and the aspen trees turned gold on the mountainsides, I finally felt like I could relax. The legal battles were over. The harassment had stopped. My property was secure. I'd made friends, built a life, and honored my family's legacy. One evening in late September, Tom stopped by again with fresh trout from the lake. We grilled them on the porch and talked about the upcoming hunting season, about the early snow predicted for October, about everything except HOAs and legal battles. It was exactly the kind of evening my grandfather probably enjoyed on this same porch 70 years ago. "You settling in okay?" Tom asked as we watched the stars come out. "Better than okay. This is home now. Good. Your grandpa would be pleased." After Tom left, I sat alone on the porch a while longer. The cabin was dark behind me but warm and welcoming. I'd added some solar-powered lights along the pathway, not because any HOA required it, but because I wanted them. That was the difference. Every choice I made about this property was mine to make, not dictated by some board of neighbors who thought they knew better. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondered where she'd ended up and whether she'd learned anything from the experience. She'd been so convinced of her own authority, so certain that rules and standards mattered more than history and property rights. In the end, her rigidity had destroyed her position and exposed her ex-husband's crimes. There was probably a lesson in that about flexibility and humility, but I doubted she'd learned it. The real lesson, I thought, was simpler. Don't mess with a man's home, especially when it's been in his family for 80 years. Don't assume your rules apply to everyone. And definitely don't try to force someone to tear down a log cabin that predates your entire neighborhood by half a century. Winter came early that year. By November, snow was piling up around the cabin, and I was grateful for the wood stove my grandfather had installed and the solar panels that kept my lights on when the grid went down. I worked from home, My laptop connected to satellite internet that no HOA could threaten to disconnect. The chickens stayed warm in their insulated coop. The old Ford was safely stored in the barn my grandfather had built alongside the cabin. In December, I got a Christmas card from an unexpected source. Inside was a simple note: "Mr. Winters, I hope you're well. I've moved to Oregon to be closer to my daughter. I'm working with a property rights advocacy group now, helping people understand HOA documents before they buy homes. I wanted you to know that your case opened my eyes to problems I was too stubborn to see. Thank you for standing your ground. Patricia Hendricks." I wasn't sure what to make of the card. An apology would have been better, but acknowledgement was something. I tucked it into my grandfather's filing cabinet, next to the deed and all the legal documents from our battle. Maybe someday it would be a historical curiosity, evidence that even the most rigid people could change. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on everything that had happened since Patricia first pulled into my driveway in that silver Mercedes. The stress, the uncertainty, the anger, and finally the victory. It had been worth it, not just because I'd won, but because I'd learned what my grandfather's legacy really meant. It wasn't just 40 acres and a log cabin. It was the principle that some things are worth fighting for. That history matters. That property rights are fundamental. That you don't let bureaucrats and self-important HOA presidents push you around, even when they seem to have all the power. On New Year's Eve, I stood on the porch with a glass of whiskey, watching fireworks in the distance over Clearwater Pines. The development looked pretty from here, all those uniform houses lit up for the holidays. But I was glad to be outside the boundaries, free to live on my own terms. My grandfather had built this cabin as a refuge, a place where he could live independently after years of taking orders in the military. He'd raised his family here, teaching them the value of self-reliance and hard work. My father had preserved it, understanding its importance even though he'd built his own life elsewhere. And now it was mine to protect and pass on. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe I'd meet someone and raise my own family here. Maybe I'd eventually pass it to children or nieces and nephews who'd appreciate its history. Or maybe I'd be the last Winters to live in this cabin, the end of a line that stretched back to 1947. Whatever happened, I knew the property was secure. No HOA could threaten it. The deed was clear, the legal precedent was set, and the lessons had been learned. As midnight approached and the new year began, I raised my glass to the mountains, to my grandfather's memory, and to the stubborn independence that ran in our family. The wooden house that violated Patricia Hendricks's standards was still standing, still strong, still home. And it would stand for decades more, a testament to one veteran's dream and one grandson's determination to protect it. The story could have ended there, but life has a way of adding postscripts. In March of the following year, I got a call from a law student at the University of Montana who was writing her thesis on property rights and HOA overreach. She wanted to interview me about my case. I agreed, figuring it might help educate future lawyers about the importance of checking historical records before assuming HOA authority. The interview took place at the cabin. The student, whose name was Sarah Mendez, was thorough and thoughtful. She asked about every detail of the case, from Patricia's first visit to Charles Hendricks's sentencing. But she also asked about the emotional toll. "A lot of people in your situation would have just given up," she said. "The legal fees, the stress, the uncertainty, what kept you fighting?" I thought about it carefully. My grandfather survived World War II. He came home and built this place with nothing but determination and hard work. Giving up would have dishonored that. Plus, I knew I was right. The law was on my side, I just had to prove it. Do you think HOAs serve a legitimate purpose? Sure, for people who want that kind of structure. But they're not for everyone, and they definitely shouldn't be able to expand their authority through fraud. There needs to be accountability. Sarah's thesis, which she sent me a copy of when it was finished, made a compelling argument for HOA reform. She cited my case as an example of why oversight was necessary, why property owners needed better protection, and why historical property rights should take precedence over newer association rules. I hoped it would make a difference. By summer, 2 full years after Patricia's first visit, I'd become something of a reluctant advocate for property rights. I spoke at a few events, always emphasizing that I wasn't anti-HOA, just pro-accountability. I encouraged people to read their documents, understand their rights, and push back against overreach. But mostly, I just lived my life. I tended my garden, raised my chickens, wrote code for clients across the country, and enjoyed the Montana wilderness that surrounded my grandfather's cabin. The log walls stood strong, the green metal roof kept out the rain and snow, and the gravel driveway crunched satisfyingly under my tires every time I came home. Tom and I became closer friends. He taught me to fish properly, to hunt elk in the mountains, to identify medicinal plants in the forest. In return, I helped him set up solar panels on his own property and fixed his computer when it inevitably broke down. It was the kind of mutual support that communities used to be built on, before HOAs and subdivisions divided people into rule followers and rule enforcers. In August, the Flathead County Commission invited me to participate in a panel discussion about HOA governance. I shared the stage with a lawyer, a county official, and surprisingly, the new president of the Clearwater Pines HOA. He was the retired accountant I'd heard about, a mild-mannered man named George Peterson, who seemed genuinely committed to running things properly. The previous administration made mistakes, George said during the discussion. We've implemented new procedures to prevent those mistakes from happening again. Every property boundary is being verified. Every document is being reviewed. We're working to rebuild trust with our members and with the broader community. After the panel, George approached me. Mr. Winters, I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA for what you went through. It was wrong and it never should have happened. I appreciate that. If you ever change your mind about joining the association, you'd be welcome, but I understand if you prefer to remain independent. I do. But I'm glad to see someone responsible in charge now. We shook hands, and I realized that I'd stopped being angry somewhere along the way. The fight had been necessary, but now it was truly over. I could move forward without bitterness, just satisfaction that I'd protected what mattered. As fall approached again, bringing the gold aspens and crisp mountain air, I reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. I'd gone from being a newcomer trying to escape Seattle's chaos to being an established member of the community, known not just for my legal battle, but for my commitment to the land and the values it represented. The wooden house that had started this whole mess was more than just a structure now. It was a symbol. Every person who drove past and saw those log walls knew the story. They knew that property rights had been defended, that fraud had been exposed, that one person standing firm could make a difference. My grandfather's dream had survived, not just the original threat from Patricia and the HOA, but the test of time itself. The cabin would stand for decades more, I was certain of it. And when my own time came to pass it on, whether to family or to someone else who'd appreciate its history, I'd make sure they understood what it represented: independence, integrity, the courage to stand up to authority when that authority is wrong. The wisdom to know that some things, like a log cabin built in 1947 by a veteran's hands, are worth more than any architectural guidelines or HOA standards could ever measure. I spent that evening on the porch, as I did most evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains. The chickens were settling in. The solar panels had stored enough energy. The garden was ready for harvest. Everything was exactly as it should be. And the wooden house that violated their standards stood proud and strong, exactly as my grandfather had built it, exactly as it would stand for generations to come. No HOA president, no forged signature, no amount of harassment could change that now. The deed predated their rules by decades, And that was the only standard that mattered.